Hello and welcome back to Beyond Jerusalem. We're going to explore the history of the Church of Christ in Central Europe yet again. I hope you're enjoying this class and finding the content intriguing and encouraging. This is session 4. If you have the reading guide, you'll know that we're going to be looking into the area of what today some call Balkan, the Balkans. This region is rife with various conflicts and border disputes, ethnic differences, and religious controversies. And it appears that it's always been the case for a very long time. And so this is a potentially inflammatory study. However, I think we can all recognize our world is a tinderbox ready to be set ablaze. And religion so often is the source of such blazes. If you don't have the reading guide, it's okay, um, but it is helpful. And so if you do not have the reading guide, which just breaks out each week's readings, um, to go along with these videos, let me know and we can certainly accommodate you. If you do not have a copy of Grimm's work, the work of Hans Godwin Grimm, Tradition and History of Churches of Christ in Central Europe, also please let me know, or just do a really good Google search. And there are plenty of great sites that host copies for you to download. We are moving into the region that you see on your screen. Please ignore the pink boxes. I like the map. The pink boxes have no relevance for our study today, other than to say that some of what we're going to talk about took place in the areas that you see boxed off in pink, the coast of Croatia and the borderlands of Slovenia, what we'll be looking at as referred to as Slovenia. But last week we were down here, really in this region, talking about the Paulicians. We were understanding some of the things that we can speculate they practiced and believed, taught and wrote down over the centuries. And what we know is that Grimm ties the Paulicians in with a group that really has a stronghold in this region, the land of Bosnia, southern Hungary, Central Europe. Again, this region often referred to as Balkan or the Balkans. These groups are referred to as the Cathars and the Bogomils. Bogomil roughly translates into friend of God or beloved of God. These groups have over the centuries been claimed by various groups. Many groups who are not either Catholic or Orthodox, which typically means some variant of Protestant, will see the history that we're about to look at, or at least some part of it. And they'll say, well, I'm not Catholic, I'm not Orthodox, so these people must be my forefathers. It's a fair assumption. However, as we'll see, sometimes we have evidence that the Cathars, the Bogomils, do not practice some of the things that some of these groups that want to claim them practice, or they don't affirm some of the things that these groups want to affirm. What we find more often is that they end up being very similar to what we practice in the Church of Christ, what we believe in the Church of Christ. Of course, as we saw with the Paulicians, the history of these groups is often written by those who persecuted them, those that had a reason to either play down their distinctive doctrines, misrepresent their distinctive doctrines, or sometimes outright lie about what they believed and practiced. However, there's also the real factor that these groups were not always speaking the same language. Very rarely do we have the cohesion that you would want to have among these different groups. So when you have Roman Catholics who speak one language trying to understand the practices of churches in Bosnia who don't speak the language the Roman Catholics speak, there are bound to be misunderstandings. Those misunderstandings can often rise to the level of heresy and fuel persecutions, subjugations, etc. For our purposes today, Grimm identifies the Cathars and the Bogomils with the Paulicians and all of these groups with the Church of Christ that we know today. Now, there is ample literature responding to the history of each of these groups that describe a kind of belief system among these groups that we would not adhere to. We don't adhere to. We don't believe there are two gods. We do not believe that the material world is evil by necessity. We do not have a view of Christ's divinity that cannot be substantiated by the scriptures. The claim is that the Bogomils, the Paulicians, the Cathars do. The claim is that they had what is called a dualistic theology, which really what I suspect is a misunderstood or at least poorly recorded theology that oversimplifies what in reality were probably some pretty nuanced beliefs that were firmly articulated. This is a claim that we in the church have to downplay a lot and struggle with. We do not practice our worship services. We do not practice our faith alongside musical accompaniment. Oh, you hate music? No, it's not at all what we teach or believe. Well, that's a dualistic format right there. Oversimplifying that format would say, let's say 300 years, 400 years, 500 years from now, they would say that groups living in wherever we're living, wherever you live, had a dualistic belief that regarded music as evil and silence as divine. No, it's not what we believe. But if our beliefs were misrepresented, misunderstood, oversimplified, or undermined for some political purpose, it could very well be that the history reflects that we believe those things that we don't believe. That could very well be some of what happens in this region among these groups that were neither Catholic nor Orthodox, or for that matter, Muslim. As we'll see, that third group, the Ottoman Turks, made incredible efforts to come in and seize this region, and they did. And for a period of several hundred years, this was Islamic territory. I know I'm using the cursor a little broadly here. I had Greece, but this region was Islamic from about the year 14 1463, Bosnia falls to Muslim invaders, and it remains properly Islamic until the 1800s. Before then, if we back up, the power players were the Romans and the Eastern Orthodox. Now, of course, this is an oversimplification, but it's important to remember that there was a period around the very beginning of the new millennium. Historians say 1054 is the year it happened. East and West split. The Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire become two properly distinct forces. What we know today as the Roman Catholic Church is upheld in the West, and what we know today as the Eastern Orthodox Church is upheld in the East. Now, this is not the whole story, but for our purposes today, just understand that during the period we're looking at, the Romans are wanting land, and the Byzantine Eastern groups, they're wanting land. And this land is already populated by Cathars, Bogomils. And in order to claim the land, you have to claim the faith of the people, and the people have to claim your faith as their own. So there are great efforts to convert these people. And the record shows that was very difficult to do. And the record that we're going to be looking at is quite amazing. It's one that is somewhat difficult to access, although it's available online. You can find it, the Internet Archive. It's difficult to access for many of us because it's written in French. And if you don't speak or read French, then it's difficult to understand what this book contains. In fact, there are two books. This edition, I think, puts them both in one, but properly, there is volume 1 and volume 2 of Charles Smith's History and Doctrine of the Cathar sect. And this is the book that we're going to be looking at today. And it, in many ways, affirms the very things that Grimm records in his brief accounting of the history of the church in this region at this time. So we're looking at excerpts from a French text that I've translated to give us a deeper insight into what was going on in this region. So before we do that, I'll go back to the map, and I want to say this. Many people, when you ask them to give the most prominent place where you will find churches of Christ in the world ever, where is the church strongest? Where are they going to point? I know where they might point, depending where they are in the world. Many people from where I'm from will point to one of two states in America. If you're in Latin America, you'll point to places in Brazil, perhaps a few other places. If you're in Asia, I don't know where you'll point. If you're in India, you'll go south. You'll look at the hundreds and thousands of congregations meeting in Andhra Pradesh. But I don't think anyone would ever point to this region, specifically to Bosnia. However, starting around the year 1100, Bosnia is home to perhaps what is the greatest civilization of Christians the world has ever seen. Why do I say greatest? I say great because of how prosperous, how successful, how committed these people were. As you see, Grimm gives an account of almost 70% of Bosnians were members of the Church of Christ. That is a staggering number. I don't know of any other population of this size that features that kind of statistic. So for this reason, we should admire Bosnia. We should revere its history as being a major home place for the apostolic faith. Part of the value, I hope, that you'll find in this class is to begin to look at the world differently. These aren't obscure countries that do not feature any kind of relevant history for us. These are the former motherlands of our faith, whose histories have yet to be fully uncovered, perhaps will never be uncovered, but they are important. The gospel was taught here, believed here, and practiced here. Blood was shed to preserve the faith of the scriptures. So it's important that we do everything we can to propagate the knowledge that I hope this class delivers. So, looking again to this book and a couple of excerpts that I think are compelling, we'll just read them. And if you don't like my narration, you have the video. Just go at your own pace. But for those who want to hear some of the things that I have to say, I welcome you to keep on listening. Schmidt writes, since the end of the 11th century, Dalmatia, Slovenia, and Bosnia had been successively united under the scepter of the Hungarian kings. In the 13th century, impenetrable forests still covered vast stretches of these lands, inhabited by men still half savage. Although divided in dioceses and governed by Christian kings, Hungary proper, Slovenia, and Bosnia, as well as Bulgaria, had yet to fully feel the civilizing influence of the gospel. Very quickly, when Schmidt is writing, he is not writing to affirm the Cathar faith the way Grimm is writing. Grimm writes with the belief the Cathars are proper Christians. Schmidt does not. Schmidt is writing as either a Catholic authority or an Orthodox authority, or maybe some other group's authority, but he is certainly no friend to the Cathars. He is no friend to the Bogomils. In fact, look at how he describes them, men half savage, who do not live under the civilizing influence of the gospel. So when we read this, please be sure that he's not going to be speaking in a positive way about the Bogomils or the Cathars. However, he does give great details about what their lives were like. Now, look at where he says the Cathars live and who they were. He says the Cathar Church freely reigned in all the lands on the bank of the Danube, the right bank of the Danube. It had establishments in Hungary, Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia, and the maritime provinces of Istria, Dalmatia, and Albania. Among the Bulgarians, as well as in Macedonia and Thrace, it also still counted great number of faithful adherents. This is all the territory that we just looked at last week, where the Paulicians were preaching and teaching. This is that area that overlaps with some of the biblical lands. We recognize Macedonia and Thrace. These are those lands where Schmidt says the Cathars and the Bogomils have relationships. So he's agreeing with Grimm here that the Paulicians were formerly the Paulicians came before the Cathars, and the Cathars inherit the Paulicians' faith. He says the province where the Cathars were most powerful was Bosnia. By the end of the 12th century, they reportedly had more than 10,000 devoted followers there, both among the nobility and the common people. This is significant. When he describes Ban Kulin, who was the ruler there in Bosnia, Ban, B-A-N, is a title like Caesar or Candace. It reflects the royal title. And what Schmidt is saying is that the Cathar faith was not just for common people, peasants, it was for even the nobility. He says the Cathar ministers publicly taught their doctrines and increased the number of their proselytes daily. One of their main strongholds in Bosnia was the castle of Dumno. On your screen is not the castle of Dumno, but it's the region. This is what it may have looked like. And notice that the Cathars were evangelical. They were seeking to make converts. They were getting people out of one religion and into another. He says in Slavonia, their center was the fortress of Požega. This province formed one of their most important dioceses. In Dalmatia, their diocese of Tragurnium included not only the numerous Cathars of that city, but also those of Split, Dubrovnik, Zadar, and others. In the latter city, nearly all the nobles were believers and supporters of the sect. The dioceses of Bulgaria, Philadelphia, and Thrace and Constantinople still flourished in the mid-13th century. In Constantinople, there were even two Cathar churches, one for the Greeks and one for the Turks. So he was describing congregations that are widespread, rich people, poor people, educated, uneducated. They're coming together under this one faith. And he's describing the population being vibrant and influential. He says in the Slavic lands, the influence of heresy was so strong that it extended even to church dignitaries. Now, when he says heresy, he's not talking about, in fact, what he's saying is heresy means Cathar, Bogabil, what Grimm calls the Church of Christ. This is what he means by heresy. He says that the Cathar teaching extends even to the church leaders of the Orthodox Church, the Catholic Church. He says Bishop Daniel of Bosnia similarly sheltered them instead of working on converting those within his vast diocese. The Archbishop of Dubrovnik, Harbinger, secretly leaned toward Cathar beliefs himself. Similar cases can be found in Hungary as late as 1218. The Bishop of Vas on the Danube was accused of deviating from the Orthodox faith. So there were a class of Catholic and Orthodox clergy who secretly held to Cathar doctrine, or at least were very sympathetic to it. Here's an interesting Next, Schmidt records about two brothers coming from a beautiful part of the world, Split, in Croatia, which you see on your screen. He says around 1200 there were two brothers in Split, Matthew and Aristodius, who excelled in painting and working with precious metals. They were artisans. Gifted with an active intellect, they were as proficient in Latin as they were in Slavic language. Their craft often brought them to Bosnia, to the court of Prince Kudlin, where they undoubtedly embraced the heretical doctrines with enthusiasm. In Split, they quickly became known as some of the most zealous supporters of their sect. Their fervor in spreading their new beliefs gained many proselytes, but also led to their downfall. What an interesting account. Two brothers who were craftsmen, they were intellectually very vibrant people, and they were from a neighboring country who, because of their great talent, found themselves before royalty. And it was from royalty in a neighboring country they learn about this faith. And they take it back to Croatia, back to Split, gain many followers, are bold in preaching and teaching this faith, and then Smith's going to tell us what happened to them. He says Archbishop Bernard, provoked to oversee this matter, well, Smith goes on to say that Matthew and Aristodius were taken into custody. Evidently, they were acknowledged to be problems for the powers, the religious powers of the state church, and so they were under torture compelled to recant their beliefs. The ruler that got them to do this was Archbishop Bernard of the Catholic Church. Schmidt goes on to say that Bernard then turned his attention to the Cathars in Troja, forcing many of them to leave the city. Most of these exiles, along with those from Split, sought refuge in Bosnia, where they were received with great sympathy not only by Kulin, but also by the Catholic bishop Daniel. Others found shelter with Nicholas, the bishop of Feria. These are figures that we just looked at were very sympathetic to the Cathar religion, and again, perhaps Cathars themselves, while holding these religious posts. Later on in history, Schmidt says that Cathars, after a period of time, boldly regained dominance in a certain region. Catholic churches, already few in number, ceased to hold services altogether. Abandoned by their clergy, priests left their posts, and Catholicism fell into complete obscurity. You don't hear statements like that very often anywhere in the world. You don't ever hear about Catholicism falling because another religion is coming to prominence. Perhaps atheism, perhaps something else, but it's quite rare to hear about Catholicism being replaced by another faith. Schmidt says by 1221, in all of Bosnia, Orthodox preaching had been replaced entirely by the sermons of the Cathar ministers. And the number of the faithful adhering to Rome dwindled daily. The heretical bishop of Bosnia wielded extensive influence. From all directions, members of the sect came to him, seeking some advice, others seeking refuge under his protection. He even sent a delegate to France to encourage the Albigensians, assuring them that they had been brethren praying for them and offering a haven from their persecutors. So we're moving forward in time, of course, and perhaps different areas, but it's important to see that over time, according to Schmidt, the Catholic faith took a tremendous toll, took a tremendous hit because of the work of these Cathar ministers. Then he tells us about perhaps one of the most intriguing figures, John Odson, who you can read about more independently, who succeeded his uncle in 1207, granted eventually the Cathars complete freedom. For many years, they were left undisturbed in practicing their heretical worship. The extent of their power became widely known throughout the West, and soon the term Bulgarians became synonymous with Cathars among Catholics. Bulgarians, of course, acknowledge that they are